The war lasted 10 years, and it was the bloodiest conflict the galaxy had ever seen. Dominion threw everything they had against the alliance that humanity had helped to build, and they burned worlds and slaughtered billions, and they fought with the desperation of an empire that knew it was dying, but they could not stop what had begun. Humanity kept sending ships and soldiers and supplies, and they kept coming even when the losses were terrible, and even when victory seemed impossible. They fought alongside the Volanthi and the Kethrani and the Morvani and the Thalani and a dozen other species who had joined the uprising. They learned to work together and to trust each other and to believe that freedom was worth any price. Daniel Carter did not live to see the end of the war. 18 months after he rescued Empress Kyra Lith, he led a ground assault on a Dominion breeding facility where thousands of slaves were being held and processed for genetic harvesting. The mission was successful, and the slaves were freed, but Daniel was hit by plasma fire during the extraction, and he died before the medics could reach him. He was 53 years old. His last words were a message for his daughter, and a Volanthi soldier recorded them and promised to deliver them no matter what. Amy Carter received the message 3 weeks later when her medical frigate was stationed near the front lines. She sat alone in her quarters, and she pressed play, and she heard her father's voice for the first time in years. Amy, he said, and his voice was tired, but calm. I am sorry for all the years I was not there, and I am sorry for all the things I missed, and I am sorry that I will not be there to see you grow into the woman I know you will become. But I want you to understand something. I spent most of my life running away from hard choices, and I told myself that I was just trying to survive, and that the problems of the galaxy were too big for one person to fix. And then I saw a woman about to die for no reason other than that she had tried to help others, and I realized that I had been wrong about everything. Sometimes one person can make a difference, and sometimes the choice to act is the only choice that matters. I love you, Amy, and I'm proud of you, and I hope that someday you will understand why I did what I did. The message ended, and Amy sat in silence for a long time. Then she wiped her eyes and went back to work, because there were wounded soldiers who needed her help, and the war was not over yet. The final battle took place above the Dominion homeworld 7 years after Daniel Carter died. The Allied fleet numbered over 10,000 ships from 100 different species, and they faced the last remnants of the Dominion war machine in a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The fighting lasted 3 days, and the casualties were enormous on both sides. But in the end, the Dominion fell. Their emperor was captured, and their government collapsed, and their 12,000-year empire crumbled into dust. The liberation of the conquered worlds took another 3 years, and it was slow and painful work, because the Dominion had left scars that would take generations to heal. But it was done. Empress Kyralith lived to see her homeworld freed, and she lived to see her people begin to rebuild. And she lived to see the alliance that had saved them transform into something new, a galactic federation, where all species were equal, and where no empire would ever again be allowed to conquer and enslave. She was very old now, and her silver skin had faded to gray, and her 4 eyes no longer glowed as brightly as they once had. But every year on the anniversary of her rescue, she gathered her people together, and she told them a story. She told them about a human named Daniel Carter, who had been nobody special. He was a shipping contractor from Nebraska who had spent most of his life hauling cargo between outer colonies, and he had a daughter he loved and regrets he carried, and he had never planned to be a hero, but he had looked at a woman in chains, and he had made a choice. He had chosen to act when acting seemed impossible, and he had chosen to fight when fighting seemed hopeless, and he had chosen to believe that one person could make a difference, and he had been right. The chains had shattered, and the fire had spread, and the galaxy had changed forever. Kyralith told this story every year because she wanted her people to remember what it meant to be brave, Not the kind of bravery that came from having power or weapons or armies, but the kind of bravery that came from looking at something terrible and deciding that you could not just stand there and watch. Amy Carter attended one of these ceremonies near the end of her life. She was an old woman now, and she had spent her years healing the wounded and training new doctors and helping to build the medical systems that served the Federation. She stood in the crowd and listened as Kyrillith told the story of her father, and when the ceremony was over, Kyrillith found Amy and took her hands and looked into her eyes. "Your father saved my life," she said, "but that is not why I tell his story. I tell his story because he showed everyone that the impossible is only impossible until someone decides to try." Amy smiled, and she thought about all the years she had spent wondering if her father had made the right choice. She knew now that he had, because sometimes the most important thing a person can do is go first. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to accept that nothing can be done. Daniel Carter had been that person. Because of him, the galaxy was free. The end. The message reached Earth 14 days after Selethi launched from the asteroid belt, and it arrived on every frequency in every human language, and it told a story that changed everything. It told the story of the Dominion and their 12,000 years of conquest and their 400 conquered star systems, and their belief that they were the rightful masters of all life in the galaxy. It told the story of the Volanthi and their peaceful civilization and their healing arts and their terrible Fallon. It told the story of Daniel Carter, who was a shipping contractor from Nebraska, who had started a war by refusing to watch a woman die. The message was played on every news network and discussed in every government chamber and argued about in every home and workplace across the planet. Some people said it was a hoax, and some people said it was a trap, and some people said that humanity should stay out of affairs that did not concern them. But many more people looked at the images that Selethi had brought, and they saw the ruins of Volanthi cities, and they saw the chains on the Empress, and they saw the face of Daniel Carter, who looked tired and scared, but also determined. And they recognized something in that face. They recognized a man who had made a choice, and they recognized the choice itself, because it was the same choice that humans had been making since the beginning of their history. The choice to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. The United Earth Council convened an emergency session within hours of the message arriving, and representatives from every nation gathered to debate what should be done. The debates were fierce, and some argued that humanity was too young and too weak to challenge an empire that had destroyed hundreds of civilizations, and others argued that if they did nothing, the Dominion would eventually come for Earth anyway. But in the end, the decision was almost unanimous. Humanity would answer the call. Within days, the mobilization began, and it was unlike anything that had happened in human history, because there was no time to build a proper military fleet, and no time to train soldiers, and no time to develop new weapons. So humans did what they had always done when faced with impossible situations. They improvised. Cargo haulers were stripped down and fitted with whatever weapons could be mounted in the available space, and mining vessels had their drilling lasers reconfigured for combat, and research stations were converted into mobile command centers. Colony transports from Mars and the Moon launched with crews of volunteers who knew they might never see home. Again, engineers worked around the clock to install armor plating and shield generators and targeting systems on ships that had never been designed for war, and through it all the people of Earth watched and waited and hoped. Amy Carter was among the first to volunteer. She was 19 years old, and she was studying to be a doctor, and she had not seen her father in 3 years, and now she learned that he was alive on the other side of the galaxy, fighting an empire. She joined the crew of a medical frigate that would follow the fleet into combat, and she told the recruitment officer that her father had shown her what it meant to make a choice. The fleet launched 6 weeks after the message arrived, and it was not a beautiful sight. The ships were mismatched and patched together, and they looked like something that children might have built from spare parts, and they had no business going to war against the Galactic Empire. But they went anyway. Dominion detected them long before they arrived in Volanthi space, and High Command was confused because their intelligence reports said that humans had no significant military capability. They sent a single battle group to intercept the human fleet, and it was supposed to be a simple demonstration of Dominion power and a warning to other species who might be watching. The battle group consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and 40 support vessels, and they had enough firepower to destroy a small planet. The human fleet had 200 ships, and most of them were held together with hope and welding tape. The Battle of Kepler Transit began at dawn. According to the local star, the Dominion commander ordered his ships into a standard engagement formation, and he expected the humans to break and run when they saw the size of his force. The humans did not run. Instead, they scattered in every direction, and they used asteroids and debris fields for cover, and they attacked from angles that made no tactical sense. The Dominion ships tried to form firing lines, but the humans refused to stay in one place long enough to be targeted, and they darted between the larger vessels like insects, avoiding a SWAT or a cargo hauler named the Nebraska Dream, ran directly into a Dominion cruiser, and both ships exploded in a ball of fire, and the human crew had known they would not survive. But they did it anyway, because it created an opening for 3 other ships to slip through. A mining vessel used its drilling laser to cut through the armor of a support ship, and then crashed into the hole it had made. A research station broadcast false sensor readings that made the Dominion think they were being attacked from behind. And when they turned to face the phantom threat, the real attack came from above. Battle lasted 9 hours, and when it was over, every Dominion ship had been destroyed. The human fleet had lost 63 vessels and over 2,000 people, but they had one news of the victory spread across the galaxy faster than light could travel, and it reached every slave world and every hidden resistance cell and every conquered people who had been waiting for proof that the Dominion could be defeated. And everywhere the news reached, the response was the same: if humans could do it, then so could they. The Volanthi resistance emerged from hiding and attacked Dominion supply lines. The Kethrani revealed the weapons they had been stockpiling for 50 years. The Morvani launched their hidden fleet from underwater bases. The Bistas Thalani stopped pretending to serve and started actively sabotaging Dominion operations. The war that Daniel Carter had started with 7 improvised explosives had become a galactic uprising, and it was only beginning. Word spread through the slave networks faster than the Dominion could contain it, and within days, the story had reached every corner of the conquered planet and beyond. A human had attacked the execution of an Empress, and a human had destroyed a command platform and killed a dozen high-ranking officers, and a human had rescued the most wanted prisoner in 3 sectors and vanished into the Earth itself. The story grew with each retelling, and in some versions, there had been 100 humans who attacked the arena, and in others, Daniel had killed the High Arbiter with his bare hands, and in still others, he had called down fire from the sky using some mysterious human technology. The truth was more modest, but also more powerful one: ordinary man had looked at the impossible and decided to try anyway, and for the first time in living memory, someone had fought back against the Dominion and won. High Arbiter Zorvax had survived the collapse of the viewing platform, though he had lost an arm and most of his dignity, and he stood before the holographic images of the Dominion Council and explained how a single primitive from a backwater planet had humiliated the greatest empire in the galaxy. The Council was not pleased. They demanded that the human be found and that the Empress be recaptured, and that examples be made of everyone who had helped them escape. Zorvax sent thousands of soldiers into the ruins of the city, and they searched every building and every tunnel they could find, and they tortured captured slaves for information, and they burned entire districts to the ground. But they did not find Daniel Carter or Empress Kyrielith Bows. The tunnels beneath the mountains went deeper than any scanner could reach, and They connected to cave systems that stretched for hundreds of miles, and the Volanti survivors knew every twist and turn in the hidden chamber. Daniel found himself at the center of something he had never expected. More survivors emerged from hiding every day, and they were drawn by the impossible news that someone had defied the Dominion and lived, and they wanted to see the human who had done it. Other species began to make contact as well, and they used ancient communication channels that the Dominion had never discovered, and they sent messages of support and offers of alliance. The Kethrani were an insectoid species whose homeworld had been conquered 50 years ago, and they had been waiting for any sign that resistance was possible. The Morvani were aquatic beings who had lost 3 colony worlds to Dominion expansion, and they had been secretly stockpiling weapons in hidden underwater bases. The Thalani were a race of telepaths who had pretended to serve the Dominion while feeding information to resistance movements across the galaxy. All of them had been watching and waiting and hoping that someone would show them it was possible to fight back, and now someone had Kirillith translated for Daniel as representatives from each species sent their messages, and he listened with growing amazement as he realized the scope of what he had begun. Dominion controlled over 400 star systems, and they had been expanding for 12,000 years, and they had absorbed or exterminated every civilization in their path, and no one had ever stopped them. No one had ever tried quite like this. Daniel sat with Kirillith in a quiet corner of the chamber one night, and he asked her to tell him everything she knew about the Dominion. She told him that they were an ancient species who believed they were the rightful rulers of the galaxy, and that all other life forms existed only to serve them. She told him that they had never lost a war because they overwhelmed their enemies with numbers and firepower, and because they crushed any resistance so brutally that no one dared to fight back. She told him that they feared nothing because they had never encountered anything that could threaten them. Daniel listened carefully, and then he asked a different question. What would they fear if they could fear something? Kirillith was silent for a long moment. Unknown, she said finally, and change. She explained that the Dominion had built their entire civilization on the assumption that they were the apex of galactic evolution and that no species could ever challenge them, and every conquest reinforced this belief, and every surrender proved them right. They did not know how to handle failure because they had never failed. Daniel smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. He told Kirillith something about humans that she had not known. He told her that humanity had spent its entire history fighting against odds that should have destroyed them, and that they had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that would have wiped out any sensible species. He told her that humans were stubborn and creative, and they did not know how to give up, even when giving up was the smart thing to do. He told her that back on Earth there were billions more just like him. Kirillith looked at him with her 4 luminous eyes, and for the first time since the invasion began, she felt something that might have been hope. She asked Daniel what he wanted to do next. He told her that he wanted to send a message to Earth. The Volanti survivors gathered around as Daniel explained his plan, and many of them thought he was crazy because Earth was so far away and humans were such a young species, and what could they possibly do against an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds? But Kirillith silenced them with a gesture. She told them that she had seen this human do the impossible once already, and she was willing to believe he could do it again. There was an old courier ship hidden in an asteroid belt on the edge of the system, and it had been there since before the invasion, and the Dominion had never found it. Ship was fast, and it had the range to reach human space if the pilot was willing to take risks. One of the younger Volanti volunteered to fly it, and her name was Southie, and she was barely old enough to be called an adult, but she had fire in her eyes and hatred for the Dominion in her heart. Daniel spent 3 days composing his message, and he wrote about everything he had seen and everything he had learned, and he asked for help. He did not know if anyone would answer. He did not know if anyone would believe him, but he knew that he had to try because trying was all he had ever known. Dosalathi took the message and climbed into the courier ship and launched into the darkness. Between stars, Daniel watched her go, and he felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened next, he had done everything he could now. It was up to his fellow humans to decide what kind of species they wanted to be. The first explosion tore through the shield generator in a cascade of blue lightning that arced across the execution arena and struck down a dozen Dominion guards where they stood. The second and third explosions hit the viewing platform at the same moment, and the entire structure collapsed inward and buried the Dominion commanders under tons of burning rubble, and their screams were lost in the roar of destruction. Guard towers fell next, and they toppled like great trees cut down by an invisible axe, and the soldiers inside were crushed beneath the weight of stone and metal smoke. And fire filled the arena, and the slaves, who had been forced to watch, began to scream and run in every direction, and the surviving Dominion soldiers fired their weapons blindly into the chaos without knowing what they were shooting at. Daniel Carter ran. He had no real plan for what came after the explosions, and he had assumed that he would die in the blasts, along with everyone else, but somehow he was still alive and still moving through the smoke and confusion. He had grabbed a metal pipe from the debris as he ran, and it was the only weapon he had, and it was not much against an army, but it was better than nothing. The execution pillar still stood in the center of the arena, but its power had died when the shield generator exploded, and the chains that had bound Empress Kyrillith were now nothing more than dead metal. She was still kneeling there with her silver skin covered in ash, and her 4 eyes wide with shock as she watched this strange soft-skinned creature come sprinting toward her through the flames. Daniel skidded to a halt in front of her and grabbed her chains and pulled with all the strength he had. The metal groaned and bent, and Daniel felt something tear in his shoulder, but he did not stop pulling. The chains snapped apart with a sound like breaking. Bone Scarella stared at him, and in 4,000 years of recorded Valanti history, no one had ever done what this human had just done, and no one had ever defied the Dominion like this, and no one had ever rescued a condemned prisoner from the execution square itself. Daniel grabbed her arm, and his translator chip struggled to find the right words in the Valanti language, but some things did not need translation. He pointed toward a collapsed section of wall where darkness waited beyond the firelight. Kyrillith understood. They ran together through the chaos, and Daniel kept his body between her and the Dominion soldiers who were starting to recover from their shock and organize. A pseudo-plasma bolt sizzled past his head, close enough to burn the hair on his neck, and another one struck the ground at his feet and sent him stumbling. Kyrillith caught him before he fell, and her grip was stronger than he expected, and she pulled him forward through the gap in the wall. They emerged into the ruins of what had once been a beautiful garden, and now it was nothing but ash and scorched earth, and the skeletons of trees that had stood for centuries. Behind them, the Dominion regrouped, and alarms began to scream across the entire city, and searchlights swept through the smoke, and thermal sensors hummed to life as the soldiers began their hunt. But Kyrillith knew this world in ways that no invader could ever understand. She had been born in the palace that overlooked this garden, and she had played in these grounds as a child, and she had explored every corner of the ancient city that surrounded it, and she knew that beneath the surface there were tunnels and passages that stretched back thousands of years, and that no Dominion scan had ever detected. She pulled Daniel toward a pile of rubble that looked like nothing special, and she pushed aside a stone that was perfectly balanced despite its massive size, and revealed a narrow opening that led down into darkness. Daniel hesitated for just a moment, because the hole looked barely wide enough for him to fit, and he could not see anything waiting at the bottom. But the sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and he could hear Dominion soldiers shouting commands, and he knew that staying here meant death. Squeezed into the opening and dropped into the darkness. The fall was longer than he expected, and he landed hard on a stone floor that knocked the wind out of him, and for several seconds he could not breathe or move or think. Then Kyrillith landed beside him with the grace of someone who had made this journey many times before, and she helped him to his feet and led him deeper into the tunnels. They moved in absolute darkness for what felt like hours, and the passages twisted and turned, and sometimes they had to crawl through spaces so tight that Daniel felt the stone pressing against his back and chest at the same time. They waded through flooded chambers where cold water came up to their chests, and they climbed down ancient shafts, using handholds that had been carved into the rock by people who had died before humans had learned to make fire. Sometimes they passed through ceremonial halls where the bones of Volanthi ancestors rested in crystal alcoves, and Kyrillith paused to touch each alcove with her fingertips in a gesture of respect. Daniel said nothing during these moments because he understood that some things were sacred. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of darkness, they emerged into a hidden chamber deep beneath the mountains that surrounded the ruined city. Torchlight flickered against stone walls, and Daniel saw dozens of Volanthi faces staring at him from the shadows. These were survivors who had been hiding here since the invasion began, and they had gathered supplies and weapons, and they had been waiting for something. Without knowing what they were waiting for, they stared at Daniel like he was a ghost or perhaps a god, because they had heard the explosions far above, and they had felt the ground shake, and now their Empress stood before them alive, and Kyrillith spoke to them in her own language, and Daniel could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was telling them what had happened, and she was telling them about the human who had shattered her chains. One of the survivors stepped forward, and she was an older woman with scars on her face, and she looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. She asked a question, and Kyrillith translated it for him. "She wants to know why you did this." Daniel thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about Amy, and he thought about his life, hauling cargo across the stars, and he thought about all the times he had looked away from suffering because it was easier than getting involved. He thought about the look in Kyrillith's eyes as she knelt before the execution pillar, and how she had maintained her dignity even when she knew she was about to die. Could not just stand there and watch, he said. Finally, his translator converted his words into Volanthi, and the survivors murmured among themselves. The older woman nodded slowly, and there was something in her eyes that might have been hope. It had been a long time since any of them had felt hope, and Daniel Carter, who had never planned to be a hero, found himself wondering what came next. The great halls of the Volanthi homeworld had been burning for 7 days now, and the smoke still rose into the purple sky like a prayer that would never be answered. Empress Kyrillith stood in chains before the tribunal of the Dominion, and her silver skin was marked with the ceremonial cuts of shame that her captors had carved into her flesh as a sign of her defeat, and her 4 luminous eyes that had once glowed with the wisdom of her ancestors were now dim with exhaustion and pain. The Dominion had come without warning, and their massive warships had blocked out the twin suns that had warmed the Volanthi world for millions of years, and the people had looked up at the sky and seen only darkness and death descending upon them. The Volanthi were a peaceful species, known throughout the galaxy for their skills in diplomacy and the healing arts, and they had spent thousands of years building a civilization based on kindness and cooperation, and they had believed that such things would protect them from harm. They had been wrong. The Dominion fleet had unleashed orbital bombardments that turned great cities into craters of molten glass, and ground forces had swept across the continents, killing anyone who resisted and enslaving everyone who surrendered. And within just a few days, a civilization of 12 billion souls had been crushed beneath the iron fist of conquest. Now their Empress knelt in the wreckage of her own throne room, which the Dominion had converted into a public execution arena, and thousands of enslaved Volanthi had been forced to gather and watch their beloved leader Die High Arbiter Zorvax towered over the kneeling Empress, and his body was covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like black. Armor and his mandibles clicked together as he read the charges against her in a voice that echoed across the ruined. Halkirillith was accused of crimes against the natural order of the galaxy, and she was accused of harboring refugees from other worlds that the Dominion had conquered, and she was accused of refusing to submit genetic samples for the Dominion breeding programs that would turn her people into slaves forever. Sentence was death by disintegration, and it would be broadcast live across 300 star systems as a warning to anyone who might think of defying the Dominion. Kirillith accepted her fate with the quiet dignity that her ancestors had shown in times of great darkness, and she had no regrets because her people had lived with honor, and she would die the same way. But somewhere in the gathered crowd of Dominion soldiers and enslaved witnesses there was a human man who was watching everything with eyes that burned with something the Dominion had never seen before. His name was Daniel Carter, and he was a 42-year-old cargo hauler from Nebraska who had been captured 3 weeks ago when his ship accidentally strayed into Dominion territory, and he had been brought here to watch this execution so that he would understand what happened to those who defied the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The Dominion soldiers who guarded him thought he was just another weak primitive from a backwater planet, and they paid no attention to him as he stood among the other slaves. But Daniel was not watching the execution with fear or hopelessness. He was counting guards. He was noting patrol patterns. He was studying the energy-dampening field generator that kept the Empress bound in her chains. Daniel Carter was not a soldier, and he had never been trained for combat or rescue missions, and he had spent most of his adult life hauling medical supplies between outer colonies because the pay was good, and he had grown tired of life on Earth. He had a daughter named Amy, who was 19 years old now and probably in college, and he had missed most of her childhood while chasing contracts across the stars, and he had always told himself that he would go back someday and make things right. But right now in this moment, he was not thinking about going home. He was thinking about the woman kneeling in chains before him, and the look in her eyes that reminded him of something he had seen once in a documentary about prisoners of war and how some people could maintain their dignity even when everything had been taken from them. Something old and stubborn stirred inside Daniel Carter, and it was a feeling that humans had carried with them since the days when they were just frightened apes huddling around fires in the darkness. And it was the feeling that said no, and I will not accept this, and someone has to do something. Daniel knew that he was going to die today, knew that one armed human could not possibly defeat an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds, but he also knew that he could not stand here and watch this woman be executed without at least trying to stop. I began to move through the crowd slowly and carefully, and he kept his head down so that the guards would not notice him, and his translator chip picked up fragments of conversation from the other slaves around him. They were broken and hopeless, and they had seen too many executions to believe in miracles anymore. Did not believe in miracles either, but he believed in explosives. The Valanthi had been sophisticated engineers before their world fell, and their cities were filled with advanced technology that the Dominion had stripped for anything obviously valuable. But they had overlooked many things that did not seem dangerous at first glance. Daniel had spent 20 years maintaining starship engines, and he knew power systems like he knew his own hands, and he knew that the small power cells used in Valanthi surgical equipment could store an enormous electrical charge. He slipped away from the crowd and made his way through the ruins of a medical facility that had been destroyed in the initial bombardment, and he searched through the rubble until he found what he was looking for: 7 power cells that had been overlooked by the Dominion salvage teams in a collapsed warehouse. Nearby, he found industrial adhesive and timing circuits from demolished factory equipment, and he began to work the twin suns moved slowly across the sky, and Daniel had only 6 hours before the execution was scheduled to begin. He worked faster than he had ever worked in his life, and his hands moved with a precision that surprised even himself. And he thought about Amy and how she used to watch him fix things around the house when she was little, and how she would hand him tools before he even asked for them. He thought about all the things he had never told her, and all the moments he had missed, and he promised himself that if he somehow survived this day, he would find a way to send her one last message by the time the suns began their climb toward noon. Daniel had constructed 7 improvised explosive devices, and they were crude and dangerous, and they would probably kill him, but they would also kill a lot of Dominion soldiers. He placed them carefully around the execution arena, and he put 2 near the shield generator and 3 at structural weak points in the viewing platform where the Dominion commanders would be seated, and 2 more at the base of the guard towers. Then he returned to the crowd, and he waited. The arena filled with spectators, and more slaves were dragged in to watch, and Dominion officers took their seats on the elevated platform with expressions of bored cruelty on their alien faces. Empress Karalith was dragged to the center of the arena and forced to her knees before a disintegration pillar that hummed with deadly energy. High Arbiter Zorvax delivered his final condemnation, and his voice boomed across the square like thunder. Daniel checked the timer he had hidden in his sleeve. 30 seconds remained, closed his eyes, and thought about Amy one more time. He hoped she would understand why her father had chosen to die on an alien world for a woman he had never met. 10 seconds. The High Arbiter raised his staff to signal the executioner. 5 seconds. Daniel opened his eyes. 2 seconds. 1 second. The world became fire and thunder, and everything changed forever.